It was 10 o'clock when 8-year-old Jia Xuqin heard a knock at the door. Upon opening it, her uncle was greeted by a Japanese soldier dressed in his uniform and wielding a bayonet that gleamed like snow. In just a few minutes, Jia Xuqin's entire family would be murdered and raped right before her eyes. Jia Xuqin's story is just one out of the 300,000 stories that faced a similar fate at an event the world had almost forgotten. Tonight, I'll be revealing what happened at the rape of Nanking, one of the most egregious war crimes the world has ever seen. Personally, I came to learn about this event after randomly coming across a book on Amazon. It was Iris Chang's Rape of Nanking, and after taking 3 months to read it, my perspective on what I thought I knew about World War II changed drastically. The Rape of Nanking is a story of torture, rape, hope, and survival. This 6-week hell occurred during the early years of World War II and started when the Japanese invaded China in the summer of 1937. Starting at the fort of Wangping, the Japanese moved inland through Shanghai until they finally reached Nanking. At the start of the invasion, rather than protecting their people, the Nanking government officials, their military, the wealthy, and anyone able-bodied fled before the Japanese completely occupied the city. This left the elderly, ill, families, and young children to fend for themselves behind the great walls that surrounded the city. The people left reached desperate levels of helplessness. I mean, who wouldn't? With no government, no military, nothing, wouldn't you feel desperate? Wouldn't you done whatever it takes to survive? The soldiers left at Nanking didn't even try to resist the invasion attempts. In fact, shortly after the city fell, around 7,000 troops gathered in one place and surrendered while holding 2 white flags. This sight completely shocked the Japanese soldiers who were accustomed to fighting to the end and never surrendering. This sight single-handedly grew so much animosity within the Japanese soldiers that it became one of their driving motivations to commit the crimes they did at the rape of Nanking. Now that the city was entirely defenseless, the Japanese began their 6-week, threefold policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. Starting with the prisoners of war, the Japanese were ordered to kill all captives. They started by rounding up the 57,000 male civilians and soldiers left at Nanking and transported them to Mufu Mountain. There, the Chinese were surrounded in a crescent formation and executed by firing squad. And as if that wasn't enough, the Japanese finished the execution by bayoneting each body one by one until all 57,000 corpses were decapitated. The bodies left were piled up to form mountains of dead corpses that lined the streets of the city or simply dumped into the Yangtze River, causing the river to run red from blood for days. The civilians were subjected to a variety of ways of torture, from being buried to the neck down while horses and tanks ran them over, to having pieces of their flesh carved out of their skin. Some were decapitated, while others had their noses and ears sliced off before their entire body was set on fire. One thing was for certain: no one could escape the cruel acts of torture the Japanese inflicted on the civilians. But women were left with the cruelest form of torture: rape. The Japanese raped elderly, wives, children. No woman could escape it. Out of the thousands of stories that I researched, One that stuck out particularly was Xia Xuqin's, who I mentioned earlier. This is her story. As the 30 or so soldiers walked into her house, Xia Xuqin's father fell to his knees, begging the soldiers to spare his family's lives. But without even an ounce of hesitation, the Japanese shot him dead and turned their attention to her mother. Her mother was shaking in fear when the soldiers grabbed her from underneath the table where she was hiding with her 1-year-old daughter. They grabbed the 1-year-old from her hands and threw her to the ground, killing her instantly, as the other soldiers tore apart her mother's clothes and did the unthinkable. They did the same with Xia Xuqin's 2 older sisters. Out of the 9 people in that house that day, only Xia Xuqin and her 4-year-old younger sister survived. Xia Xuqin was just 8 years old when she witnessed her entire family murdered and raped. And her family was just one out of the 80,000 victims who were brutally raped by the Japanese. And after all that, you might be wondering, why? How could the Japanese relentlessly ruin the lives of hundreds of thousands of individuals? The Japanese were trained to become desensitized to the crimes they'd be committing. They were taught to value the Chinese as less than a dog or cat and to not see them as human beings. Some were taking the training camps where they practiced bayoneting and decapitating living prisoners of war, while others were forced to compete in killing competitions where they compete to kill the most Chinese people. With every life they took, the soldiers became more and more numb to their actions. Killing became a routine, a chore, and everyday life for these soldiers. Through this, the men were turned from innocent youth to killing machines. Those who survived the event lived with the scars of their past for the rest of their lives. Many of the women impregnated from the event were forced to make the harsh decision of whether or not to raise their rapist baby. Bodies of pregnant women were found in the Yangtze River because many of the women couldn't bear the decision and killed themselves instead. Although some did receive compensation from the Japanese government, it wasn't enough to survive. And because so many of the survivors had such extreme injuries, most couldn't even work to earn a living wage, and they continued to live in poverty with their stories buried underneath the modern architecture and luxury hotels in Nanking today. Their stories have been left untold, forgotten, and even denied that the rape of Nanking even occurred in the first place. We students grow up learning about tragic events that happened during World War II and other mass tragedies. So why do our teachers and education fail to educate us about the rape of Nanking, an event in which hundreds of thousands of people were wrongly murdered, tortured, and raped? Why do we neglect the proper education of this event to our people? The rape of Nanking deserves to see the light of day. It deserves to be talked about, to be discussed, and for justice to be served to its victims. The victims' stories deserve to be recognized not just by historians, but also by governments and by us. Because for years, the rape of Nanking was considered a myth, heavily debated whether it even occurred or not. But now, in 2023, with substantial evidence and proof, no one can deny the destruction, the torture, or the trauma the people of Nanking faced during the event and years to come. So are we going to let this event be forgotten again? Are we going to deny that it even occurred in the first place? Or will we continue to be bystanders and let this event slip under our noses as it has for the past 85 years? Because like Elie Wiesel once said, if we forget, we are guilty. We are accomplices. We could not prevent their deaths the first time, but if we forget them, they will be killed a second time. And this time, it will be our responsibility. Thank you.